Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am really glad you are here with us today. We are doing something a little bit different for this one.
Yeah, we are.
Usually we take a pretty broad topic, right? And we pull from a dozen different places, maybe piece things together. But today we're fixing our attention on a single massive piece of scholarship.
Right, a real deep dive.
Well, precisely. We are opening up Robert H. Mounce's commentary on the book of Romans. And we aren't trying to swallow the whole book in one sitting. That would be...
impossible.
Yeah, completely impossible. We're keeping our eyes strictly on chapter 1.
It is really the only way to do it. You cannot rush Romans. I mean, Martin Luther said this book was the chief part of the New Testament.
Right.
He called it the purest gospel. He actually thought a Christian should know it word for word by heart.
Wow, by heart.
Yeah. And when you pick up Mounce's work, you realize why he felt that way. Mounce treats the text with this incredible reverence. He balances the technical Greek grammar with a really careful pastoral sensitivity.
But he doesn't pull his punches, does he?
No, absolutely not. Romans 1 is a confrontation. It challenges how we view our leaders, how we view ourselves, and, well, how we understand the whole world around us.
It really is a confrontation.
Hmm.
I was reading through the notes on the latter half of the chapter earlier today, and it felt like reading a diagnosis of the morning news.
It does. It really does.
But before we get to the scary stuff, and it does get pretty scary, we have to start where Paul starts, the messenger.
Right. Verse 1.
Yeah. Mounce spends a lot of time just on the way Paul introduces himself right out of the gate. Quote, Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God.
Those three descriptors carry a lot of weight. Slave, apostle, set apart. And that first one is where Mounce really makes you stop and think.
Because of the translation, right?
Yeah. We usually hear the English word servant there, and we think of, like, a butler.
Right, or maybe someone who helps out at a local charity.
Yeah, it sounds noble, humble, maybe a little soft.
Sounds like a volunteer position, like you sign up for it.
But Mounce points out that the Greek word here is doulos. It means slave. There is no ambiguity about it at all.
None.
And you have to put yourself in the shoes of the original audience. This letter is going to Rome.
The center of the world.
The absolute center. It was a society built entirely on status, hierarchy, and military might. In that culture, a slave was literal property.
They had no rights.
A slave had no will of his own. A slave was at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. So for a Roman citizen, calling yourself a slave as your opening line would be shocking.
It would be demeaning.
Very demeaning.
So Paul is essentially opening his letter to the most arrogant established city on earth by saying, hi, I am a nobody.
In a social sense, yes. But Mounce catches a brilliant nuance here. Paul isn't writing with a Roman mindset.
He's writing with a Hebrew mindset.
Precisely. And in the Old Testament, the phrase slave of the Lord wasn't an insult at all. It was a title of the highest honor.
Oh, that makes sense.
It was the title used for Moses. It was used for Joshua. It was used for David.
That is a massive shift in perspective.
Yeah.
So he isn't saying, I am a piece of property with no value.
Right.
He is actually saying, I stand in the line of Moses.
Right. I answer to the same boss that David answered to.
That's a paradox. To the Roman world, it looks like slavery. But to the believer, it is the highest dignity imaginable.
And Mounce connects this to a very reformed idea. Paul says he was called to be an apostle.
Right.
He did not volunteer for this. He didn't look at a list of career options and circle apostle.
I think that's something we often forget today. We talk about finding our calling, as if this is a treasure hunt we initiate.
Yeah.
But Mounce really stresses that the initiative was entirely God's.
It is the doctrine of effectual calling in action. Think about it. Paul was hunting Christians to kill them. He was not looking for a job opening in the church.
No, not at all.
God stopped him. God called him. God set him apart. And Mounce notes that the phrase set apart implies a destiny that was in place before Paul was even aware of it.
It aligns perfectly with what we see in Galatians, right?
Yeah.
Where Paul says God set him apart from his mother's womb.
Absolutely.
This really cuts against the grain of our modern celebrity culture, doesn't it? Even inside the church. Mounce has a critique here that I found pretty sharp. He talks about the celebrity posture.
That stood out to me too. We live in an era where leaders, especially Christian leaders, often project an image of success, autonomy, and influence.
We want to be influencers. We don't want to be slaves.
But Mounce warns that this celebrity posture is a spiritual disaster. Pride is the root of the fall.
Always.
If Paul The man who wrote half the New Testament and planted churches across the known world saw himself primarily as a slave who was only there because God decided to put him there. What excuse do we have for an ego?
We really don't have one.
Mounce suggests that Christian leadership requires a daily recognition of this status. We are under orders. We do not set the agenda. The master sets the agenda.
And the slave just executes it. That leads us right into the agenda itself. The message. Paul moves from his identity to the content of the gospel in verses 2 through 4. And Mounce points out that this wasn't a new invention.
No, it wasn't Paul's new idea.
Right, it was promised beforehand through the prophets.
This is crucial for the Jewish audience in Rome, but also for us. The gospel isn't a replacement of the Old Testament. It is the fulfillment of it.
Yeah.
But what I love about Mounce's analysis here is how he breaks down the description of Jesus. You have this two-sided coin.
The two natures.
Yes. Verse 3 talks about his human nature, being a descendant of David, and verse 4 talks about the Spirit of holiness, declaring him with might to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead.
Human and divine, true man and true God, the hypostatic union.
Exactly. Mounce notes that the Davidic lineage is what gives Jesus the legal right to the messianic throne. He had to be a man, and he had to be that specific man from that specific family to fulfill the prophecies.
But a human king isn't enough to save us.
Right. A human king can rule a country, but he cannot conquer death.
And that is where the resurrection comes in. Mounce makes a very strong point here about the resurrection being the declaration.
The authentication. Without the empty tomb, Jesus is just another Jewish teacher who got on the wrong side of the Romans and got killed for it.
He would just be a footnote in a history book.
A tragic footnote, but not the Son of God in strength. The resurrection changes the category entirely. It moves Jesus from teacher to Lord.
And Mounce quotes C.S. Lewis here to drive this home, the famous trilemma.
I love that argument.
I think it is one of the most helpful tools in apologetics. But for the listener who maybe hasn't heard it or hasn't thought about it in a while, walk us through what Lewis and Mounce are getting at there.
Well, the modern world likes to say things like, I don't believe Jesus was God, but I believe he was a great moral teacher.
We hear that all the time.
I like the Sermon on the Mount, but I don't buy the divinity stuff. Lewis argues that this position is logically impossible.
Because of what he claimed.
Right. Jesus didn't just tell people to be nice to each other. He claimed to forgive sins. He claimed to be one with the Father. He claimed to exist before Abraham.
Yeah.
If a regular guy on the street walks up to you and says, I am God, and I can forgive your sins, you don't call him a great moral teacher.
You call the guys the white ghosts.
You call him insane. Lewis says he would be on the level of a man who says he is a poached egg. That is the first option, lunatic.
Okay, what's the second?
The second option is that he knew he wasn't God, but he said it anyway to deceive people. That would make him the devil, a liar.
So he is either a lunatic, a liar, or...
He is who he said he is. He is Lord.
So Mounce is using this to show that Paul leaves us no middle ground. You cannot just tip your hat to Jesus. You have to bow your knee.
That is the only logical response to the resurrection. And that brings us to verse 5. Paul talks about the goal of his apostleship. He says it is to bring about the obedience that comes from faith.
Now, wait. I want to pause here because this phrase, obedience that comes from faith, can get tricky for us in the Reformed camp.
It can.
We are the faith alone people. Sola fine. When Mounce talks about obedience and faith being linked, is he blurring the lines there? Is he saying we are saved by our obedience?
That is a vital question, and Mounce is very careful here. He is not saying that obedience is the root of our salvation. He's saying it is the fruit,
Okay.
but he is also saying you cannot have the root without the fruit.
Unpack that a bit more.
Mounce argues that faith is not just intellectual assent. It isn't just looking at the Lewis trilemma and saying, okay, logically, the Lord option makes the most sense.
Right, that is just data processing.
Biblical faith involves surrender. Mounce says to surrender is to obey. You cannot accept Jesus as Savior, the one who saves you from hell, without accepting him as Lord, the one who owns your life.
So if I say I have faith, but my life looks exactly the same as my pagan neighbor's life, like I am not obeying anything Jesus said,
Correct.
Mounce would question if I have faith at all.
He definitely would. He quotes a scholar named E. Best who says, only in obedience is there faith. It is like fire and heat. You can distinguish them in your mind. Fire is the chemical reaction, heat is the result. But in reality, you never have a fire without heat.
If there is no heat, there is no fire.
If there is no obedience, there is no faith. The gospel isn't just an insurance policy, it is a complete transfer of allegiance.
It is a tough word, but a necessary one. It keeps us from what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace.
It does, and it sets the stage for the rest of the letter. Paul expects the Romans to live differently because they believe differently.
Speaking of the Romans, let's look at how Paul relates to them. We are moving into verses 8 through 15 now. This is the pastoral heart section.
Yeah.
And the first thing that Mounce notes is the order of Paul's prayer. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you.
It is a lesson in priorities. Think about how we usually pray.
We usually start with the gimme list.
Right. God, help me with this, fix that, give me this. Paul starts with thanksgiving. And notice the intimacy there. My God.
Religion wasn't a theory for Paul. It was a relationship.
And he is thanking God for their reputation. He says, your faith is being reported all over the world. That is incredibly high praise.
It is. But then he does something dramatic right after that. Verse 9, God, whom I slave for in my spirit in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness. He puts God on the stand as a witness.
He does.
Why does he do that? It seems pretty intense for just a greeting.
Well, because prayer is private. I can tell you, hey, I'm praying for you, and you have no way of knowing if I actually am. I might just be being polite.
Right, we say that all the time.
But Paul is saying, I really am doing this constantly. And the only one who knows that is God, so I call him to testify. It shows the intensity of his care for them.
And Mounce draws a really beautiful insight here about the nature of ministry.
The part about preaching versus prayer.
Yes, Mounce suggests that we often get it backward. We think the main work of a minister is the public stuff.
Yeah.
The preaching, the teaching, the administration.
But Mounce argues that the real work is the prayer. He quotes Frank Laubach, who said it is the preacher's business to look into God's face until he aches with bliss.
Aches with bliss. That is a stunning phrase.
It really is. And Laubach goes on to say that if a sermon doesn't rise out of that kind of encounter, that aching with bliss, then it is just words.
It's empty.
He says it is like fruit tied onto a dead tree. It looks real, but there is no sap, no life.
Mounce is challenging every pastor, every teacher, every parent, really, to realize that you cannot give what you do not have. Paul's public ministry was fueled by this hidden, intense prayer life.
But Paul isn't just a mystic on a mountain. He wants to see them. He wants to visit Rome. He says in verse 11, I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong.
Typical apostle. He has something to give. He's the expert.
But then, catch the correction in verse 12. Mounce loves this. Paul immediately clarifies, that is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith.
He backs up. He catches himself.
He does. And Mounce points out that this shows Paul's character better than a polished speech ever could. It is incredibly humble.
He realizes, wait a minute, I am not just coming to lecture you. I need you.
Even the great apostle Paul needed the encouragement of regular believers. It goes back to that idea of not having a celebrity posture. We are all parts of the body. The eye needs the hand. The apostle needs the layman.
He also mentions being obligated. He says, I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish.
The Greek word implies a debt. Paul felt he owed the gospel to the world. And this is interesting. He didn't owe it to them because they were worthy. He owed it to them because of what he had received.
Mounce explains it with that great analogy.
Right. If a doctor discovers the cure for a plague that is killing everyone and he has the medicine in his pocket, he is obligated to hand it out. He's in debt to the dying because he holds the life.
And he specifically mentions Rome as a place for a harvest. Mounce talks about the timing here. Why was Rome ready for a harvest right then?
Because the alternatives had failed. Mounce notes that the pagan mystery religions, the cults of Isis, the Mithraic mysteries, they were popular, but they were totally empty.
They had rituals and myths, but they couldn't deal with real guilt.
They couldn't give any assurance of peace. The Roman world was spiritually exhausted. They were cynical. And Mounce says God had prepared the field. The hearts of the Gentiles were ready because they had tried everything else and found it wanting.
That feels very familiar. We see a lot of spiritual exhaustion today. People trying politics, technology, self-help, and ending up burned out.
The field is always white for harvest when the idols start failing.
So Paul is ready. He is eager.
Yeah.
He is not ashamed. And that brings us to the thesis statement of the entire letter, maybe the most significant verses in the New Testament. Romans 1:16-17.
Yeah.
I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the dynamic strength of God for the salvation of everyone who believes.
Let's stop on that phrase, not ashamed. Mounce asks, why would he be tempted to be ashamed in the first place?
Well, we have to remember where he is going. Rome, the city of Caesar, the city of marble and gold and legions.
And Paul is coming with a message about a Jewish carpenter who was executed by a Roman governor in a dusky province on the edge of the empire.
It sounds ridiculous to a Roman ear. Here is your king, the guy on the cross.
It was foolishness to the Greeks and a stumbling block to the Jews. By all worldly standards, the gospel is a weak, pathetic message. But Paul flips the script. He says, no, this isn't weakness. This is absolute might.
And Mounce clarifies that this might, the Greek word dynamis, isn't just potential.
It isn't like a battery sitting in a drawer. It is active. It is the dynamic activity of God. The gospel doesn't just tell you how to save yourself. The gospel is God saving you.
When the message is preached, God is effectively working.
And then we get the why, verse 17. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed. This is the phrase that changed history. This is what Luther agonized over.
It is the pivot point of the Reformation. Righteousness from God. Mounce outlines the debate here because it is so critical. What does that phrase actually mean? There are three main options.
Okay, lay them out for us.
Option 1, it is an attribute of God, meaning God is faithful to his own character. He is doing what is right.
Option 2, it is an activity of God, meaning God coming in to save his intervening force.
And option 3, it is a status given to man, a forensic status. Justification.
And this matters because if it is just God's attribute that he is holy, that is bad news for us because we aren't.
Right.
If it is just his activity, that is better, but it is vague. But if it is a status, if it is a gift, that changes everything.
And where does Mounce land?
He sides with scholars like Cranfield who argue for the status view. He admits that all three are connected. God gives the status because he is faithful and active, but the primary meaning here is that God provides the righteousness that he demands.
This is the alien righteousness Luther talked about.
Right. Think of it like a courtroom. You are guilty. You have a stack of speeding tickets a mile high. You cannot pay them.
You're bankrupt.
Righteousness from God isn't the judge saying, I'm a nice guy, so I'll ignore the law. That would be unrighteous.
And it isn't the judge saying, go out and try harder to be a good driver. That doesn't fix the debt.
Exactly. Righteousness from God is the judge stepping down from the bench, taking off his robe, and paying the fine for you. Then he gets back up and declares you not guilty. The legal status of righteous is transferred to you.
It is a gift. You don't earn it. You receive it.
That is why Paul quotes Habakkuk, the righteous will live by faith. It is the only way to receive the gift. Hands empty, just faith.
So that is the peak. That is the glorious news. The judge pays the fine, but then Paul turns the page, verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven.
It is a cliff edge. You go from the sunlight of the gospel into the absolute dark of human depravity. And Mounce argues you have to go there. You cannot appreciate the rescue until you understand the danger.
Now, wrath. That is a loaded word. We hear that and we think of Zeus throwing lightning bolts. We think of a guy losing his temper and punching a wall. Is that what God is doing?
No, and Mounce is very specific about this. We have to strip away our human projections. Human anger is usually a loss of control. It is capricious. It is selfish.
God's wrath is none of those things.
Mounce defines it as God's settled divine displeasure with sin.
Settled displeasure.
It is a principle. It is the necessary reaction of a holy God to unholiness. Think of it this way. If God looked at child abuse or genocide or cancer and just shrugged and said, whatever, he wouldn't be good.
You wouldn't be loving.
His wrath is the other side of his love for what is right. He must oppose that which destroys his creation.
So it is not a mood swing. It is his nature.
Yes. And verse 18 tells us why this wrath is coming. It is against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness.
Suppress the truth. That is a really interesting image. It sounds active.
It is very active. Imagine trying to hold a beach ball underwater. You have to exert constant pressure to keep it down. The moment you let go, it pops up.
Right.
Mounce says that is what humans are doing with the knowledge of God. We are pushing it down. We are holding it under the surface.
So Mounce is saying atheism, or at least the rejection of God, isn't an intellectual problem. It is not that there isn't enough evidence.
Correct. That brings us to general revelation, verses 19 and 20. Paul says God has made it plain. His eternal might and divine nature are clearly seen from what has been made.
Mounce argues that the universe itself is a sermon.
You look at the detail of a cell or the orbit of the planets, and the natural conclusion is designer.
So the agnostic who says, if God would just write his name in the sky, I'd believe, is bluffing.
According to Paul, yes. Mounce says the problem isn't the lack of evidence, it is the suppression of evidence. It is a moral rebellion, not an intellectual one. We don't want there to be a God because if there is a God, we are accountable to him.
So we hold the beach ball down.
And the verdict, so that men are without excuse. The Greek word is anapologetus. It is a legal term.
It means you have no defense.
When you stand before God, you won't be able to plead ignorance. The creation testified against you.
And because we suppressed the truth, we started to devolve. Mounce calls this the exchange.
Verse 21, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. Mounce notes that the first step away from God is usually simple ingratitude.
We stop saying thank you. We start thinking we did it ourselves.
And then the thinking becomes futile, hearts get darkened, and then the trade happens. They exchange the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles.
It is reverse evolution. We're supposed to look up to the Creator. Instead, we look down to the crawling things.
Mounce compares it to the Garden of Eden and the golden calf. It is the ultimate absurdity. You take the infinite, the holy, the beautiful, and you trade it for a statue of a lizard.
Or, in our day, we trade it for a career, or a relationship, or a number in a bank account. We worship the created thing rather than the Creator.
And this brings us to the most terrifying part of the chapter, the result of the exchange. 3 times, Paul says, God gave them over.
This is the doctrine of judicial abandonment. And honestly, it is one of the most frightening concepts in all of Scripture. We tend to think of judgment as God attacking us. But Mounce explains that often, judgment is God simply letting go.
He quotes Goethe here with an analogy that really stuck with me. God ceased to hold the boat as it was dragged by the current.
It is a withdrawal of restraint. It is God saying, you want to live without me. You want to be your own God. Okay, have it your way.
C.S. Lewis said in the end, there are only 2 kinds of people. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. This is the second group, and it is a nightmare.
Mounce tracks this abandonment through 3 stages in the text. It starts with the desires, then moves to the body, then to the mind.
Right. Stage 1, verses 24 and 25. God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity. The first thing that goes is sexual ethics.
Mounce notes that when you lose the vertical, your relationship with God, the horizontal, your relationship with your own body and others falls apart. They exchange the truth for the lie.
The lie being that you can be the center of the universe.
Yes, and the result is the degrading of their bodies. Sin always degrades, it never elevates.
Then we get to stage 2, verses 26 and 27. And I want to slow down here because this is where the text hits a massive cultural nerve today. Paul talks about shameful lusts. He describes women exchanging natural relations for unnatural ones, and men doing the same with men.
This is the passage on homosexuality. And we have to be honest, in our current culture, reading this feels like touching a live wire. It is labeled as hate speech by many. But our job, and Mounce's job, is to understand what Paul, writing under the inspiration of the Spirit, is actually saying. We are just reporting what the commentary highlights here.
He is unsparing with the text. He notes that Paul uses words like shameful, unnatural, and indecent. But Mounce provides important context. He brings to mind that this wasn't just Paul being a prude.
In the Roman world, homosexuality was rampant.
Mounce notes that 14 of the first 15 Roman emperors practiced it. It was culturally celebrated in many high circles. Nero famously married a man in a public ceremony.
So Paul wasn't writing in a vacuum. He was writing to a culture that was very affirming of these things.
Exactly. And Paul, coming from a Jewish creation-based worldview, calls it an abomination. But Mounce makes a critical theological point. Paul frames this not just as a prohibited behavior, but as a sign of God's wrath. It is an evidence of the giving over.
Explain that connection. How does Mounce say it is evidence?
Think back to the exchange. We exchange the creator for the creature. Mounce argues that when you reject the creator's authority, you eventually reject the creator's design.
And the most basic design in humanity is the male-female distinction from Genesis 1. Male and female, he created them.
When a society embraces same-sex relations, Mounce argues it is a signal that the society has completely severed its tether to the creator's design. It is a confusion of identity that stems from a confusion of worship.
So it's not just breaking a rule, it is a fundamental denial of the created order.
Right, and Mounce points out the phrase, receive in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. He argues that moral confusion carries its own penalty. It leads to a breakdown of the person and the society. It is built into the fabric of reality. You cannot break God's laws. You can only break yourself against them.
That is a heavy word for the modern ear. But Mounce is clear that this isn't an alternative lifestyle in Paul's view. It is a symptom of a world that has turned its back on God.
And that leads to the final stage, the mind. Verse 28. Since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind.
A depraved mind. The Greek word there means something that can't stand the test, right? Like metal that has impurities.
Yes, reprobate, useless. Mounce notes that when you reject God, you lose the ability to think straight about moral issues. Your moral compass gets demagnetized. You can't tell north from south anymore.
And out of that broken mind comes the vice list. Verses 29 through 31, Paul just rattles off 21 sins.
Right.
Envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice.
It is a picture of total social breakdown. And what is interesting is how Mounce categorizes them. It is not just the big sins like murder. It is things like gossip and slander.
And disobedient to parents. That one always jumps out at me. He puts a rebellious teenager in the same list as a murderer.
It shows that all sin is cut from the same cloth. It is all rebellion against authority. Whether you are killing a man or slandering your neighbor, you are acting as if you are God. Mounce points out the phrase, inventing ways of doing evil.
That is chilling.
It is not enough to just do the old sins. A depraved culture gets creative. They engineer new ways to be wicked.
Mounce also notes that when a society forsakes God, it eventually loses concern for people. Heartless, ruthless.
That is the endgame. If there is no God, there is no image of God in your neighbor. Your neighbor is just an obstacle or a tool. So you become ruthless. A society without God eventually becomes a society without humanity.
And that brings us to the absolute bottom, the final verdict in verse 32. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them.
Mounce calls this the total inversion of morality. This is worse than committing the sin. We all sin. We all fall short. But usually when we sin, we have a conscience that says, I shouldn't have done that.
We feel guilt. We try to hide it.
But here, the conscience is cauterized. They not only do it, they approve of it. They applaud it. Mounce suggests this is the institutionalization of evil. It is when the culture says, this sin is actually a virtue, and if you disagree with us, you are the problem.
They call evil good and good evil.
Precisely. When a society reaches the point where it celebrates what God hates and persecutes those who hold to God's standard, Mounce says you are looking at the final stage of abandonment. You are at the bottom of the spiral.
Wow. We have really traveled a distance in this deep dive. We started on the mountaintop, the gospel, the dynamic strength of God, the righteousness given by faith. And we ended in the pit, a culture that is depraved, abandoned, and celebrating its own destruction.
It is a stark contrast. But Mounce stresses that this is Paul's strategy. You have to see the black velvet of human depravity to see the diamond of the gospel.
The bad news makes the good news necessary.
Right. If you read verses 18 through 32 and think, well, I'm a pretty good person, I can fix this, you haven't understood it. The point is that we are helpless. The boat is in the current. We are suppressing the truth. We are broken. And into that hopeless situation comes verse 16, the strength of God for salvation.
We cannot pull ourselves up. We need a rescue from the outside.
We need the righteousness from God. It is our only hope. The only thing that can stand against the wrath of God is the righteousness of God given to us in Christ.
That is the Reformed hope. We don't trust in our ability to swim against the current. We trust in the one who walks on water.
Amen.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Mounce's analysis of Romans 1, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. We talked about that haunting concept of passive wrath God judging a society by letting it have what it wants.
It is the most sobering thought in the chapter.
So here's the question for you. Look around. Look at our culture. Look at the confusion, the celebration of things that used to be shameful, the inventing ways of doing evil. Do you see the signs of God letting go? And if you do, does that drive you to despair? Or does it drive you back to verse 16? Does it drive you to the only force that can save?
That is the question we all have to answer.
Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking. We will see you next time as we continue our look through Romans and tackle chapter 2.